We've been talking about the command, the sixth of the 10 commandments that, depending on the translation, says you shall not commit murder or you shall not kill. And as I've talked about over a couple of weeks, probably the better translation of either of those is you shall not kill unlawfully. It encompasses a little bit more than what we would think of as murder, and it encompasses a little less than what we would think of as killing. And so it's a sort of a fine distinction, but in law, fine distinctions are our favorite thing. So we just kind of have to deal with that. But it's interesting because, a lot of times we talk about that Greek and Hebrew have words that have multiple different meanings, and they do. And sometimes English struggles with that because we have a single word to mean those sorts of things. But interestingly, when it comes to the area of law, we have usually got a number of different definitions for what a particular crime is. And so in some ways, I'm much more comfortable with something like this particular word than I am with other ones, because it's very much in line with the way that we define murder in law. And so we have first-degree murder, which is premeditated and planned, and we have second-degree murder, which is intentional but not necessarily premeditated. Third degree is actually usually referred to as manslaughter, which is where you are not intending to actually, so you're not intending to do it, but you cause a death. Kind of by an intentional action, but not an action that was intended to cause death. So we have different degrees of that. So, Ken, you raise your hand for a second.
Yeah, does that mean lawyers like to split hairs?
We love to split hairs, yes. It's part of our job, so, And it's interesting because one of the things that we have in American law, and particularly in Arizona, we have a very well-developed set of laws regarding what's called justification. Anybody want to tell me what justification is when it comes to law?
Self-defense.
Self-defense is a justification, yes, but what does justification mean? What does it mean when we talk about it for the law of God?
You had a reason to do something.
Okay.
A valid reason.
A valid reason to do something, okay. So we talk about the idea of Jesus being our justification. And in some respects what that means is that you've done something bad, but it's been fixed by something else. And that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about a justification in law. So in Arizona law, I keep saying America, but it varies from state to state, as the criminal codes do. But in Arizona law, there are a number of different justifications for killing someone. Self-defense is one of them, but it is actually the smallest of the justifications in terms of the scope of where it applies. There are other justifications that apply. Anybody know what some of the other justifications are? I'm just curious to see how well you guys know the law. This particular law.
Protection of someone else.
Okay, so you can also commit, well, not commit murder, but you can also kill to protect someone else from certain things being done to them. Anybody want to guess what some of those things are?
Well, there was a guy driving up in the McDonald's parking lot that somebody pulled a gun and the guy in the back seat shot him.
Okay, so if they're trying to kill you, that's definitely true, yes?
Threat of bodily harm or misappropriation of property.
No.
No.
No. You can't shoot somebody because they threatened to hit you or take your stuff.
No, threat to hit somebody else.
Well, you also can't do it for that reason either.
Why not?
Because that's...
Now remember, where
You would fit in well at law school, although not when you ask about that. The teachers get mad when you talk like that to them. But no, so there's an important distinction between the safety of someone from permanent harm versus injury or theft of property. And violent or deadly force is only allowed to be used to offset or to prevent either a deadly attack or potentially deadly attack or certain specific kinds of crimes. So if someone breaks into your house and is running out the door with a TV, you cannot shoot them in the back. That's not okay. If someone is coming into your house, you don't necessarily have to wait to find out if they're going to take your TV or what they're there for. But so if someone is simply hitting someone with a closed fist, with few exceptions, using a gun to break that up or a knife to break that up is considered excessive. If someone is using a baseball bat or they've got a gun of their own where the harm that they can do is permanent or is deadly, then using deadly force is okay.
What about hostage situations? Deadly force allowed to break up a hostage situation?
Assuming that the person was being held by more than just somebody holding them by the arm or something like that, yes. So when we talk about, so as I said, there are certain crimes that are specifically or deadly force is specifically authorized under the statute, and kidnapping is one of them. And a hostage situation almost always would involve kidnapping. So again, you have a difficult time making that argument if the person was unarmed and you knew it and they were simply holding someone and they wouldn't let them go. Shooting them is probably not good. Now, if they're dragging them to a car, that's a different situation, but if they're just won't let them go, it's a different thing. So there are a variety of different ones: sexual assault, kidnapping, murder, aggravated assault. Aggravated assault is an assault that involves using a weapon or an implement or doing it in a way that could be reasonably seen as being likely to kill someone. My favorite one, though, in Arizona law, is a law that specifically says that you are justified in using deadly force to prevent second-degree sexual contact with a minor, which is basically consensual sex between an adult and a minor. And I call this the not with my daughter punk law, because that's the one where you come home and your daughter's in bed with an older guy and you just shoot him, you know, because hey, you can, that's what the law says. So I wouldn't say try that or anything, I'm just saying theoretically that's true. We used to laugh about that in the county attorney's office because we were kind of a sadistic bunch. But anyway, so there are specific times when deadly force is permitted and then when physical force is permitted, and the law makes a distinction between those two things: deadly physical force and physical force. So physical force is when you hit somebody, or potentially if you use a baseball bat, especially if you're a smaller person and they're a bigger person or something like that, but you do something to them in a way that is not designed to cause permanent injury. And so, for example, that guy running out your front door with your TV, if you want to hit him in the back of the head, that's okay, as long as you're not using, like, you know, a machete or something, then you probably have a problem. But you know, if you want to knock somebody down or do something like that, that's okay. And when somebody is coming at you and they're trying to hit you, you can hit them back. The main thing that the law is designed to try to address when it comes to justification is not to escalate the situation. So you've heard the expression, he brought a knife to a gunfight kind of a thing. You know, somebody shows up barehanded, you don't want to go and escalate that to now this is a deadly situation. Because using deadly force to prevent a non-deadly crime is counterintuitive. So, okay?
You went down first degree, second degree, third degree / manslaughter. What is the difference, and does it apply in Scripture to involuntary manslaughter versus voluntary manslaughter? In Scripture, I would probably say that it's kind of interesting, because when we talk about involuntary manslaughter, that's a situation where you had a duty for something to be careful, you weren't careful, but something happened that you really didn't foresee or intended the event to happen. Whereas manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, is where you intend the thing to happen, but you don't necessarily intend it to end in death. In the Scriptures, it's kind of interesting because that falls into that kind of that area where it talked about, you know, when you're walking along next to somebody, you just push them just because you're just messing around and they fall down and die, you're not guilty of murder. That would be voluntary manslaughter, because you did something that you meant it to happen, and maybe even you meant for them to fall down. You just didn't mean for them. You know, if you watch YouTube, there are videos of people doing just the dumbest things as pranks for you know, their friends or whatever else, pranks on their friends, I should say. And I'm amazed that some of them don't lead to people getting seriously injured or killed. Okay, so if you're walking along, if you trip and fall, and the other person is caused to fall by your tripping and dies,
that's involuntary. Actually, that wouldn't even be involuntary manslaughter, because you didn't have a duty of care in that situation. So, in law, we have this concept called a duty of care, where when I do things, I have a duty to take care to avoid reasonably likely outcomes of my actions. So I'm driving along in my car, I'm driving the speed limit, but I'm also paying no attention to what's crossing the road in front of me. I'm not technically breaking the law, but I have violated my duty of care, because if somebody runs out in front of me, I'm going to have no chance to actually stop. Or the more common one is you're on your cell phone or you're doing something like that, where it isn't that at any point you intended to hit somebody, a little kid that runs out or a car that turns in front of you or whatever, but by not paying attention fully, you have created a situation. If my car loses its tire and I suddenly am careening out of control and I hit something, unless I had reason to believe that was going to happen, I'm not going to be charged with any kind of a crime, except maybe there is now in Arizona a misdemeanor, kind of a failure to control your vehicle thing that can sometimes be applied when somebody has a situation like that one where it ends in somebody dying or being seriously injured. But if you don't have any reason to foresee what you're doing as leading to somebody else's injury in law, it's very unlikely that you're going to be charged with a crime, because there is at least some level of I've taken actions that lead in a direction. So DUI, for example, is a crime because even though by the time you are drunk enough to get in the car, you may not be smart enough to think that you shouldn't drive, you've made a series of choices that have led you to the point where you get in the car and you drive. So normally that's called strict liability, but there's still required, there still would have to be some kind of a process going through. If someone were somehow impaired because someone had been sneaking them some kind of drug and they didn't know it and they didn't realize they were impaired, that would be one of the very rare times you might be able to make a defense to DUI, because you literally had no way of knowing that you were impaired necessarily. So you have to, just because something goes wrong with you and then it cascades to other people doesn't mean that you're guilty of any sort of an offense. And I think when we talk about the situation with the Israelites, so the two distinctions I would make is what we would think of as first-degree manslaughter or intentional manslaughter, voluntary, that's what we're looking for, would be where you do something that leads to someone's death. So you can always charge somebody who's driving drunk and kills someone, you can always charge them with voluntary manslaughter. You can usually charge them with second-degree murder as well, but with voluntary manslaughter at a minimum. On the other hand, the example that they gave in the scriptures is a situation where somebody is cutting a tree. Well, the example we come across in the scriptures is where somebody's cutting a tree down and the axe head flies off and hits somebody in the head. That wouldn't even be considered manslaughter. Now, under the Israelite law, because the person died, you'd still have to go to the city of refuge to get away from the avenger of blood. But that would be viewed as a completely unintentional killing, where there was no motive, there was no intention. It was more just a bad thing happened. So, but for our purposes today, what we're looking at more is where we're using force or deadly force to offset or to prevent or stop something that is violent from happening. So what we're talking about when we talk about self-defense, in Arizona law particularly, is usually referred to as justification. And like I said, it is more often used or as often used in contexts where you are defending someone else as it is for when you are defending yourself. And in fact, many of the justifications come under the heading of law enforcement. There's actually a subset that says law enforcement justifications, and they are meant primarily or initially to apply to law enforcement. So a police officer who comes on the scene of someone who's shooting can shoot them back because that's a law enforcement function. But in Arizona, the law enforcement functions are not limited to law enforcement. They are open to any person who follows the principles of justification. There are other ones then that fall more under the self-defense category or some other limited things like that, and defense of property as well. Arizona does not have, and really no state has this, the media gets this wrong, in part because the states apply it very, very chaotically, but there's no such thing as a castle doctrine where just because someone's at your house you can shoot them. There is the belief that that's true, and in Florida and Texas there have been some cases that make it look like that's true. But the fact is that even if someone is in your house, you still have to have some reason to be concerned that they are there to threaten you or that they are a danger to you. Someone, as I said, the most common situation is someone who's stolen something who's now fleeing out of the house. They're still in your house. That doesn't mean you can shoot them. They're actively trying not to be a threat. You can't just, harm somebody and particularly kill somebody who is running away from you. And the same thing would be true if you had somebody who came into your house and they did not appear to be a threat. Maybe they appeared to be confused or dazed or something like that. If you don't have a legitimate reason to think that they're a threat to you, you cannot use deadly force against them. And so one of the things that people who talk about and teach about self-defense say is, if you are involved in a self-defense kind of a situation where you shoot somebody or you harm somebody who's come into your house, you need to be very careful about talking to the police immediately afterwards, because they're going to be looking to gather information about what you have done and why you did it. And because of the standard being what it is, you may not be able to articulate very well, what you did. And if what you say to the police is something along the lines of, they were in my house so I shot them, that may be enough to get you outside of the self-defense and justification standards. So we have to be, as Arizonans, we have a lot of options compared to people in other states, but you still have to be very careful what you do because you have to do things for the right reasons. And that's also what we see in the scriptures as well. We do see examples of self-defense. We see references to ideas that involve self-defense, mostly in the Old Law. But that's also, I think, because the Old Law is designed to be a law, whereas the New Covenant is less about laws and more about using your own judgment to decide what's right for you. So last week we took a look at this passage in Nehemiah chapter 4 where the Israelites are rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. The Arabs and some Samaritans and Ammonites, a group of different people are coming together to try to prevent this happening because the last thing they want is an established Jewish state in the middle of what has become a pretty nice place for them to be. And so as the walls of the repair of the walls of Jerusalem come together, these groups conspire together to come to fight against Jerusalem. But they are not so strong as to want to muster up an army and fight a fair, direct battle. They want to attack by surprise. And so Nehemiah sets up a situation where, because of the fact that you have to guard a whole bunch of places, and that's one of the problems when you're building a wall. If the wall isn't built yet, you have a lot of weaknesses, and you have people working all around the place. And so the problem is the risk that a large group of attackers will come up against one or two people as they're working on the wall, breach the wall, and then they're inside your defenses, and now you've got all kinds of problems. And so Nehemiah's response is to station men, first of all, in the weakest places. You notice in verse 13 it says, I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords and spears and bows. Now, why would he do it where he would station them in families? It seems like he's kind of exposing the families to unnecessary danger, doesn't it?
It seemed he had a mechanism where you defended the part of the wall that was closest to where you lived.
Okay, very likely. What else? Anything else? Any other reason why he would do it this way, where they're with their families?
There's probably, maybe perhaps a greater desire to protect your family.
Okay. So you perhaps got, unless your wife is, really just nagging all the time, and then you're like, go on, but no, so there's definitely more of a desire to protect your families. What else?
That's also kind of, did expect a family that have weapons. It's kind of hiding.
I'm sorry, say that again?
That they're in a regular house or dwelling, it's kind of hide. They're not open in the field, but they're kind of hiding the family.
So they're inside the walls, not outside the walls. And I think this gets at kind of what I think is the main thing that's going on here. First of all, there are probably people who are living outside of the city and they've been brought into the city. So they get the defense of the wall such as it is. The other aspect of it is, if you think about, most of these people had not fought in battles or wars. They had been captives. They had been 80 years in Persian captivity. Most of them had not fought in any battles. Most of them had not engaged in that kind of conflict. And so one of the things that we know is that the fewer things you have to think about if you have to fight, the better you are. The better off you are, the more things you have to figure out or that are going through your mind when you're trying to do something like that, the more distracted you are. And so one of the things that may be going on here is that let's put the families with the people that are fighting, because at least then they know where their families are. If I'm fighting and I'm wondering if maybe the wall has been breached somewhere else and now they're going towards my family and I have no control over that, I'm distracted. I don't know what's really going on elsewhere, and maybe my family's in jeopardy, but now I don't have to worry about that. Now I have to worry about protecting them, and that's true. At least I know where they are, and that I can, my efforts can be directly focused on doing that. So he stations the people in their families with their swords and spears and bows, so they're armed, they're ready to fight if they have to. And then he does another thing, which is that all of the people that are working on the wall, they work in shifts. Half of them work, and half of them are armed all the way through it and ready to fight, basically. So that way, if an attack takes place, at least half of your people are ready and can give the other half time to get ready. And the other thing that he points out is that, let's see, where is the passage? Yeah. So then the other thing is that he says, is he stations captains throughout the city to oversee the work, and who are given, and he actually has a trumpeter with him, so that if he sees an attack, he can have the trumpeter sound the trumpet so that the people will rally to his point, which is sound tactics unless they attack from multiple directions, and then you're in real trouble because you just completely undefended part of your wall. But in any event, he's working from God's guidance, so presumably that's the most likely thing to happen. So there's this idea of a plan and a plan for defending. And so what we have here, number one, is we see a great deal of thought being given to how to undertake this defense. And at no point does anybody say, wait a minute, should we just let them overrun us because we're not, we don't fight back, we're just supposed to be nice? And no one raises that issue because obviously they don't. This is their nation. This is their city that they're building. This is their job to protect what they've built. And at no point in the scriptures is there ever a prohibition on the Israelites defending themselves against invading nations. Now there are times when God says, I'm bringing these invaders because you've done evil and you're going to lose, but he doesn't tell them stop fighting because of that. With one exception, I guess, where he does actually, Jeremiah does actually tell the people, don't keep trying to fight this, this is what God wants, just go ahead and stay in Jerusalem and don't run away and don't fight. But for the most part, the Israelites fight back because that's what they do. It's their nation and they are a nation and they fight back. And so this passage is probably more directed at the authorization, I guess, for lack of a better word, of God's people to engage in war as a part of their nation. We talked a little bit about that last week, but it is important for us to realize that we've really never seen anything in the scriptures that would suggest that Christians are not allowed to fight in wars. Now, there are Christians who believe that they're not supposed to, that are pacifists and different things like that. And I think, like I said I think it was last week, that falls under Paul's ideal that he says, this is, you got to do what your conscience says. If your conscience says you don't fight, that you're a pacifist and you're consistent about that, then that's okay. That's what you should do. But at the same time, Paul also gives the commands about following the commands of your government and supporting the king. And so there's no reason that should be read to say, but you can't use any violence. Because Paul is not ignorant. He's well aware of the fact that violence is a reality. He lives in a very, very violent empire that has done some tremendous fighting over the course of its existence. And so he's not fooling himself about what that means. So I think either one of those, when it comes to war and the defense of the nation, however you want to look at it, is something that Christians are certainly allowed to do and in fact could be even expected to do. The trickier question is when it comes to self-defense, when it comes to simply somebody's attacking me. Ken?
Before you leave this, it just keeps running through my head. I keep thinking about the situation in the Middle East today, Israel and Hamas. I mean, this hadn't changed.
No, it hasn't.
Been at it for decades, millennia.
Yeah, at this point we're in a millennia. It hasn't, and as I mentioned last week or the week before, in fact, after the nation of Israel was reestablished in the post-World War II era, the first major Arab attack by all the nations around them took them very much by surprise, and they were very nearly overrun. And since then, they have had a standing principle that if you are in the military, you carry your guns with you, you carry your weapon with you when you go to the temple, or when you, well, not the temple, when you go to, I know it's taken directly out of here. When you go to the synagogue, or when you go to worship, or whatever it is, you have it with you all the time so that you can rally to the position. And what happened with this most recent attack was more than anything that it was so utterly unexpected and relatively unconventional that it wasn't so much that Israel was ever at risk of being overrun. It was simply that Hamas was able to do a lot of damage very quickly, kidnap a bunch of people and run away before most of the army was able to rally to or to focus on a specific point. And so, and Hamas went out of their way to target groups that would not have been prepared for some kind of an attack. And so this was and of course it was also at a time when there was a relatively high level of peace between Israel and the nations around them. They were in the middle of negotiations with at least one or two other nations. They'd been recognized by a couple of them already. So there's really very little reason for them to think that there would be an attack, which is of course the ideal time for a terrorist to do something like that. But this problem is an ongoing problem, and that prohibition, or that requirement, is an ongoing requirement among Israelis, that they do have to go armed if they are part of the armed services. So, okay, so when we talk about defending ourselves or defending others, one of the interesting things is you actually have some teaching. Now this is in the area of what we would call the oral Torah. It is not part of the written laws of Moses. These are writings by rabbis who either claim to be interpreting the existing Torah, or they are writing in the Talmud, which is the written collection of the oral Torah that was supposedly handed down by Moses to the Israelites. There is no actual evidence of that. It's much more likely that it was simply a development of scholars and Pharisees and that kind of teaching over a long period of time, but especially during the 300 or 400 years leading up to the first century. So the Talmud was eventually written down because there was so much oral tradition going around. But it's important to realize that these are not the words of God. These are the words of men who are saying, this is what I think, or this is what I hope God means anyway. So the most clear one is in the Talmud, where it says, if someone comes to kill you, arise and kill him first. That's about as blunt a version of self-defense as you can get right there. And like I said, that's not in the Bible directly, but it is kind of an interesting point. Just that's what they said. This one is by a fairly noted Pharisee or teacher. He says, if one sees that someone is pursuing him with the intention to kill him, he is permitted to defend himself and take the life of he who is pursuing him. Now this one is not claiming to, the Talmud claims to have been revealed by God. This is a scholar, teacher of the law person who is saying, this is how I read the law, as being this way. And certainly when we're looking at the Old Testament, that seems fairly likely. Because the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, now that's in situations where somebody has been convicted of the crime, but nevertheless, it has a very violent retributive element to it, and so it would make perfect sense that if you're being attacked, you don't have to let the person kill you, so justice can be done afterwards. That you do it before you get killed, and then you don't have to worry about, trying to have your next closest relative run them down or whatever it is. So, okay, now, this is an interesting one, and this is what we see. This is actually in the scriptures. If you read Exodus chapter 22, it talks about stealing property. It says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the oxen, 4 sheep for the sheep. That's not the important part for our discussion here. What it says then is, if a thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account. But if the sun has risen on him, there will be blood guiltiness on his account. Now, what in the world is that saying?
It's dark, you can't see what he's doing.
Okay. And if it's dark and you can't see what he's doing, what's it okay to do? Kill him. Okay, but if it's light and you can see what he's doing, it's not okay to kill him. The NIV makes it a little bit easier. A thief is caught breaking in at night and has struck a fatal blow. The defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happened after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Now, does that mean you can only defend yourself at night? Because what was this person actually really defending in this case?
Stuff.
Okay, now, but the key here is he didn't know what the person was doing. They had broken in and they didn't know what they were doing. And it's also, this is kind of an important context here to understand that in a lot of the Israelite, in the houses, you would actually have had a house with the stable attached to it. So somebody who's inside, is effectively inside your home, the same way that somebody who's in your garage may be looking to steal your car, but they may be looking to come further into your home. So the key here is you don't know what they're doing. And because you don't know what they're doing, it's not unreasonable to defend yourself to the fullest extent possible, because they could be there to kill you. Maybe they're just there to steal the ox, but if it's the first one, by the time you determine what it is for sure, it may be too late. But after sunrise, where you can see what they're doing, and they're in the middle of stealing an ox or a cattle, you can't kill them. Which is pretty much exactly the same thing as what I was talking about earlier with the guy with the TV that's running out of the house. You can't shoot him in the back or knife him or something like that in order to stop him from taking your TV. Because, and this is an important principle of law, stuff is less important than life. Okay? Life is always more important than stuff is. That's true in the old law, and that is true in American law as well. And it kind of bears itself out from where it talked about, you can't let somebody get away with murder just because they pay off a ransom or something like that. Stuff does not equal life. Okay? So, not knowing the situation, no blood guiltiness. Knowing what's actually happening, and you know that they're stealing, you can't kill them. If you do, you would be guilty of bloodshed. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't still use physical force to defend your property. You just can't kill someone. Okay, so that's an important kind of side note to think about. So let's talk about a particularly notable version of what we would think of as the defense of others that we see over in Genesis chapter 14, where Lot and his family are kidnapped along with most of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not too long, well, actually probably a number of years after Abram and Lot had entered into the land of Canaan after being sent there by God, Abram hears about this, that his relative has been taken captive, kidnapping by our standards. He called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, if you had any doubts about the wealth of Abraham, imagine that he had a small private army and realized that this is a guy who's clearly got some stuff. And it's not like he hired these guys as mercenaries. They were born in his household. So his household, the servants and people in his household had children, 318 kids who were raised to be fighters, basically. That was their job. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. By the way, who's the them in this case? Anybody know? Who is the them? Who is it that has kidnapped Lot and his family and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah?
That's what the king's name.
It's actually a group of Canaanite kings from elsewhere, actually from some distance away. I say Canaanite, they're actually from outside of Canaan. They have kidnapped them. These are kings, we call them kings, it would be city kings. They're not kings of like Nebuchadnezzar was a king kind of a thing. They're city kings, but presumably they had a number of soldiers with them because they were able to attack and take captive the inhabitants of two goodly sized cities. And so either Abraham's men are exceptionally well trained, or they're really, really good at sneaking up on people, or as almost certainly is true, God is fighting with them. But in any event, Abram is able to rout the opponents, to pursue them away, and then recover all the goods and the people, and brings back his relative Lot and his possessions together with the women and the other people. So we have a situation here where Abraham has not been attacked. Abraham has not suffered any loss. And in fact, the people by and large that were taken captive were the kind of people that probably deserved it, because this is Sodom and Gomorrah after all. Lot is about the only reason Abraham probably does anything here, but it's a good enough reason, because Lot is his what? Nephew, is the son of his brother, who his brother had died by then. So Abram is not doing this because of his love for Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, he makes that very clear to the people from Sodom when the king of Sodom says, I'll give you all this spoil, just give me back the people. And Abram's like, I'm not taking a dime from you, dude. I don't want anything to do with you. So it was nothing about them, it was only about Lot. But in spite of that, he was willing to basically gather his private army and chase after these people, kill, I'm sure, a number of them in order to recover his brother's son, because that's what family does. And so clearly we see in the Old Testament, and remember, this predates the law of Moses. This is Abraham living under the same state Paul says basically that we live under, a state of grace that comes by faith. And so in that situation, without a law specifically justifying him, Abraham had no problem doing this in defense of and to rescue his son, his nephew. So it's important to realize that we do see situations outside of even the defense of a nation where violence is used in order to prevent things from somebody from getting harmed or being taken or something like that. Now, on the other side of this, we have Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And on any number of occasions, Jesus talks about the importance of Christians making peace, of Christians doing things that will lead to peaceful outcomes, turning the other cheek, and helping people even when they're demanding things of you. He makes it clear that we are supposed to look for opportunities to avoid conflict. Now, I do think it's interesting, I talked about this in a sermon a few weeks ago, I think it's interesting that Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and of course America, because of the perversity of our thought, went around and named this the peacemaker, which I think is just, on the one hand, it sort of speaks to just how messed up we are as a nation. On the other hand, it's sort of a fantastic way of approaching reality. So the cult peacemaker is the way that we make peace by, not so much, blessed are the peacemakers, there's one. So, okay. Now, in Matthew, Jesus says, "You have heard that ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court." Now, the reason I'm bringing this out is because I want you to recognize that Jesus is saying that there's something more than just the physical action that you take. The physical action that you take is something that was regulatable under the law of Moses. But Jesus says, I want you to regulate how you think about people. I want you to regulate the attitude you have towards people. And what always troubles me with living in this state, as much as I enjoy being in a state where we do enjoy one of the broadest rights to own and carry firearms and to defend ourselves of any states in the country. One of the things that always troubles me is seeing people carrying around openly weapons in places that they know they're not supposed to. Yesterday I was at the post office. I had to mail a package, or day before yesterday, anyway, no matter, early over the weekend. And a guy came in wearing a gun. Anybody know why that's a problem?
Federal law.
It's a federal building, it's a federal law. You're not allowed to carry weapons. There's a sign up that shows that and everything else. It's always interesting to me to see people do that, because technically by violating that federal law, you can lose the right to own weapons, which seems like a kind of a high price to pay just so you can bring your gun in while you're standing in line to check out. But this guy, he wasn't subtle about it. He wasn't even wearing it like, you know, on his hip where maybe his shirt could kind of cover it or something like that. He was wearing a shoulder holster, and the gun is dangling out, and he's got 2 magazine rounds, and he's as proud as can be that he's got his gun there. And I'm thinking, when you do that, you're really committing an act of aggression. You're basically daring the people around you to create a problem, or making it clear to them that you're not the sort of person who will take anything from them, that you're ready to defend yourself. And I've always thought that that was just kind of demonstrating the wrong attitude about what we do. Now, police officers carry their weapons openly because that's their job, and we know that that's their job. And part of their authority, it doesn't come from the weapons, but they are carrying the weapons openly because they have earned that authority. They've gone through training, they have experience, and so they have a reason to be doing that. But for most of us, being that open about it is really more designed to call attention to me and to make me feel important and good. And there have been a lot of studies that show that the more open, and not in the sense of discussing things, but in the sense of openly carrying weapons around, displaying them, showing them off, that those kinds of behaviors are tied into more violent actions taking place. And that's not what we want. Now, Paul says elsewhere, okay, it's important, he says elsewhere, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. Which means that sometimes it isn't something that completely depends on us. But where it does depend on us, how we choose to, behave, how we choose to display ourselves, what we choose to say, it should not be us that's causing the problems. The guy who goes into the bar, and hopefully you're not spending a lot of time in bars anyway, but the guy who goes into the bar and starts talking trash about everybody, knowing that it's going to provoke somebody to anger. Sure, that guy may hit you first, but you did everything in your power to make that happen so that you could get into a fight. That is not the attitude of a peacemaker. The peacemaker is someone who avoids trying to create conflict, and who, even when conflict does occur, doesn't engage in it out of the thrill of doing it, or out of a desire to be violent, but simply because it's a necessary thing to put an end to what's going on. And so I think when it comes to self-defense, that we have to be very careful that our attitude, our motive is right. And the law says that. The law says our motive has to be right. But internally, we need to be making sure that when we are engaging with people, when we are interacting with people, that we are behaving in a way that promotes peaceful outcomes and not violent ones, even if we're prepared for violence. So this is a critical thing to understand. Let me stop there. I'm going to end with this here. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." And elsewhere it says, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." God is the God of justice. He doesn't have a problem with justice being done. And sometimes even with humans being the ones who do that justice, because that's what the old law of Moses talks about. And within the context of our system of laws, if we are doing things that are just, I don't think God's going to have a problem with that either. But what he has a problem with is when we are treating people poorly and creating those kinds of problems. When we are doing violence for the sake of violence, when we are seeking out and promoting conflict. And so he says, you've got to love your enemy as well as your neighbor. And then the critical thing is pray for those who persecute you. What happens when you pray for somebody? Is it easy to continue to be angry at them and hate them and want to do bad things to them? Not unless you pray the kind of prayer David did. Lord, strike down and smite my enemies, and then maybe so. Sorry, Steve?
Well, like in Matthew 5 here, where we're at, so God, through Jesus, is saying, these are not naturally the way you are. So when he says, you want to be meek or humble, gentle, thirst for righteousness, be merciful, be pure of heart, all of those things, that doesn't come naturally.
Right.
And so this stuff kind of rubs because you say, well, wait a minute, I've got people attacking me, saying things to me, spreading rumors, and I'm not even supposed to be mad about that, or mad at them, or angry, or hateful, or return an eye for an eye, or any of that. I'm supposed to just roll over and pray for them. It doesn't come naturally, but I think we focus maybe too much on the specifics of it rather than the overall intent, which is to become more godlike. And God has done so much for us when we were enemies with Him. That's the attitude we need to take.
And that's what he says there, is you want to be sons of your Father who is in heaven, because He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. He does good even to those who are evil. He makes good things happen. They receive blessings, not maybe blessings the way that we do, but blessings in the sense of positive things happening in their lives, good outcomes happening in their lives, because He is righteous and just, but also He is loving and He has grace, and He shows us grace all the time. And so it is an overall attitude. It's not necessarily, you know, a specific kind of a thing where you are my enemy and I'm going to pray for you. You know, it's not necessarily. There may be times when you need to sort of target it like that, but it is that attitude overall that we are promoting peace, that we are promoting a harmony, and that we are trying to avoid doing things that will disrupt the peace, other than the one that is almost unavoidable, which is it's almost impossible these days to preach the gospel without somebody getting mad about it. But that is what it is. You know, there's nothing we can do with that. But when it comes to, as Paul says, as so far as it comes to you, be at peace with all men. You know, it's not up to us to not preach the gospel just because it's easier, but it is up to us to try to avoid doing things that are pugnacious. I love that, by the way, and when it talks about the office of elder, I forget if it's in Timothy or Titus, where Paul says that a person who wants to be an elder, you know, they should be the husband of one wife and not fond of drink. And my favorite one is not pugnacious. And pugnacious is such a great word, because you think about, have you ever seen like a pug, and they've got that turned up nose, and they kind of look like they're ready to start a fight whenever they go somewhere. You know, they're really not. Pugs are actually very gentle, but they look like that, you know. And there's that pugnaciousness, the person, you all know people like this, the person who's looking for a fight, maybe not a physical fight sometimes, but definitely a fight with words. They're looking for a fight. We don't want to be people who are known for looking for a fight. We want to be people who, when we go around and come around people, are glad that we're there, because they know that we're going to bring peace and we're going to bring calmness to the situation. That's what we want to be known for. So
then I think also this goes also into when you have to forgive your brother, sister. I mean, certain things, yeah, you forgive. Well, they might have something ugly against you or whatever. But think about it, for the ones who had to forgive a murderer because they murdered their child. That's not easy to forgive that person.
No, it's not. And that doesn't, and forgiveness doesn't mean that there isn't still justice, and that you have to say, well, you know, just let them go.
No.
But it does mean that holding on to hate and holding on to anger, and we've seen this over and over again, it ultimately hurts the person who holds on to it more than it does. Because the guy who committed that murder, they're either going to feel guilty or not going to feel guilty. They're going to deal with that on their own. But your anger at them is not going to cause them the slightest sleepless night. You know, it cost them a minute of their sleep, because how we feel inside only really matters to somebody when it comes into how we start acting outside. And if you don't have any power over them, then they're not going to care just because you're mad, just because you're upset. And so forgiveness is much more about getting peace for the person who's doing the forgiving than it is peace for the person who needs it. Although when it's somebody who's your brother, when it's somebody who is a Christian, somebody who is trying to do the right thing, a lot of times then the need for forgiveness becomes a very real thing. That I need to hear somebody say they forgive me. I need to know that they really do forgive me, because otherwise it's got my conscience roiled up. So it's not a trivial thing in those kinds of situations, but in many cases it's much more about clearing your own mind than it is about anybody else's. Okay, we're going to stop there because we're a little bit over and we've covered everything. Next week we will start talking about the next commandment. We've now got 6 under our belts, so good work, everybody.